We have covered the first 11 chapters in the book of Genesis, and you could say that chapters 1 through 11 lay out the problem. Of course, it tells us about God's creation of all things, but then it talks about how humanity fell with Adam and Eve and how it kept falling with Cain murdering his brother Abel. And we kept falling up to the time of the flood. And then after Noah and his descendants was the Tower of Babel, mankind just kept falling. That's the problem that we see in the first 11 chapters. But in Genesis chapter 12, we see God beginning to enact the solution. The reality is God had a plan that he was working out, his plan for the ages from before the creation of the world, but God now begins to reveal his plan of the ages and to bring a solution to the problem. And he begins with one man named Abram. In fact, so far we've been dealing primarily with events, big events. People are mentioned, but it's mostly been about major events like the creation of the heavens and the earth, the fall of mankind in the Garden of Eden, the flood that covered the entire earth as God judged that entire generation, the fallout that comes from man's rebellion at the Tower of Babel, where God confuses the languages and disperses the people over the face of the earth. And now we turn a corner with a very distinct division between chapters 11 and 12. With the formation of the nation of Israel, and we go from studying great events to studying great people. We primarily look at the biographies of 4 people in particular: Abraham, who is called Abram at first, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. These 4 men will dominate the rest of the book of Genesis, but the next 14 chapters will deal with Abram, or Abraham, as he will be called. He is called the father of faith and the father of those who will believe. 3 times in Scripture, he is called the friend of God, and his influence carries over into the New Testament. So we're going to look at his story and see his developing faith. That's our title this morning, Developing Faith. Go ahead and read with me verse 1 of chapter 12, where it reads, "Now the Lord had said to Abram, 'Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you.'" Notice it says that the Lord had said to Abram. When had the Lord said that? Well, back in chapter 11, in verse 26, that's when Abram's story really begins. If you look back just a few verses in chapter 11, verse 26, it says, "Now Terah lived 70 years and begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran." Now, Haran is the name of a person, but it's also going to be the name of a place that we're going to read about as well, where they settle in for a period of time. I'll call the person Haran and the name of the place Haran. It'll help avoid confusion, and that's the original way you would pronounce the place, Haran. So continuing, verse 27 of chapter 11, this is the genealogy of Terah. Terah begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran begot Lot. And Haran died before his father Terah in his native land in Ur of the Chaldeans. Then Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife, Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Iscah. But Sarai was barren, she had no children. And Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and they went out with them from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. And they came to Haran, there's the place, and dwelt there. So the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. That's the narrative of the overarching backstory of what's happening. Then we drop in verse 1, where it says, "Now the Lord had said to Abram, 'Get out of your country, from your family, from your father's house to a land that I will show you.' Abram came from a place called Ur of the Chaldeans, which is in southern Mesopotamia, there in the southeast portion of the map there. Today it's southern Iraq. It's what we would call Babylon, from the area of southern Babylonia. Ur of the Chaldeans was the greatest commercial, most advanced cultural city of that time. It was the capital of ancient Sumer. It was a highly advanced civilization. It had a population of about 300,000 people at the time of Abram. Archaeological discoveries have revealed advancements in musical instruments and crafts. There was a university there with a giant library, and they specialized in astronomy and mathematics. It was a very advanced culture. It was also one of the centers of idolatry and idol worship. In the center of the city was this huge temple and a ziggurat, or a tower, like the Tower of Babel. There was a lot of different gods that they worshiped and goddesses that they worshiped there in Ur of the Chaldeans. This gets reinforced in Joshua chapter 24, where Joshua tells us about Abram's background. We see in Joshua 24, verse 2, he's telling the people, "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, your fathers, including Terah, the father of Abraham and the father of Nahor, dwelt on the other side of the river in old times, and they served other gods. Then I took your father Abraham from the other side of the river, led him throughout all the land of Canaan, and multiplied his descendants, and gave him Isaac." So Abram was raised in an atmosphere of idolatry. And there are ancient sources that say that Terah was like a dealer in idolatry. He made and sold statues of idols, and Abram would have been his assistant, helping him do this. So no doubt there was the worship of many gods. The moon god was the primary god that they worshiped, and other gods of nature. So all of that was his household that he grew up in. So understand, Abram was a pagan. He was a pagan before God appeared to him and called him out of that culture and brought him into this new land. We also notice two significant losses in his life. His brother Haran died before his father Terah in his native land. We see that in verse 28. That's a tragedy that would have impacted Abram's life. It was a loss that shaped his life because in addition to the loss of his brother, he became responsible for raising his brother's son, Lot. And Lot becomes a part of this story throughout the coming chapters. The other area of loss is seen in verse 30, where it says that Abram's wife, Sarai, was barren, that she had no children. So you have a man named Abram, which means exalted father, coming out of an idol-worshiping country whose brother died after he had his son, and now his wife Sarah was unable to have children. All of that shaped his life and set the stage for how God will call Abram to be the father of a great nation. And verse 1 says that the Lord had said all this to Abram when he was still in Ur of the Chaldeans. And now we get God's call to Abram in verse 1. What instructions did God give Abram to do? 3 things. Leave your home country, leave your family, and go to a land I will show you, which we will later find out is the land of Canaan. So God called Abram to leave, and he left. He left his home. But he took his family. Actually, his father took the family. We see back in chapter 11, verse 31, Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, and they left from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. And they came to Haran and dwelt there. Now, family meant everything to a person living in the time of Abram. In that time, family units were strongly knit together. It was unusual for a family member to live hundreds of miles apart from one another. Abram, he left his home, but his family came along with him. So bringing his father and his nephew was, well, you would call that partial obedience to this call, because he was told to leave his family. And because he stopped in Haran, which is their second stop, which is the northern part of the map here, when God was calling him to go all the way to Canaan. So this is partial obedience. Abram only went halfway, and he stopped in Haran. And now God repeats the promise now that Abram's father has died in Haran. But notice Abram's partial obedience, it didn't take God's promise away. Now, if I were God, and you'll be glad that I'm not, and I'm glad that I'm not, because if it was up to me, I'd be tempted to say, Abram, I told you to leave your family behind, but you didn't do it. I told you to go to Canaan, and you didn't do it. You stopped halfway, so, forget it. I'm just call off the promise. Thankfully, the God who governs the universe, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is also a God of grace and mercy. Now, Abram's partial obedience did mean that the fulfillment of the promise was delayed until Abram was ready to do what the Lord had told him to do. And when we knowingly disobey the Lord, we often delay the outworking of his plan in our lives. And that's just a part of it. And we also can experience barrenness in that. But God didn't say, forget it. He didn't say, I'm taking back my promise because you didn't respond with proper obedience. Understand, Abram will become a giant of the faith. He would even be called the father of the believing, but he didn't begin that way. He didn't begin as a hero in faith. Abram began as a man who was weak in faith and growing in faith and obedience. And that's what's happening here. And though there's much to see and admire in Abram's faith, God's promise was more important than his faith. The emphasis is God's promise. And that's what we see second here, God's promises to Abram. And in verses 1 through 3, God says, I will 5 times. He's saying, I will do this. I will do this. You can count on it. And he says, I will take you to a land that I will show you. So he hasn't told them where it is yet. Just go. Verse 2, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. God makes 3 overarching promises to Abram that form the basis of what will later be called the Abrahamic covenant, which doesn't get established until chapter 15, and then it gets ratified in chapter 17. But let's look at each of these. First, the promise of a land of his own. After stating that God wanted Abram to leave his country and to leave his family, God promised Abram a land which is going to be spelled out a little more specifically throughout the story of Abram. God promised Abram the land of Canaan. It's what we might call Greater Israel because it goes far beyond the boundaries of what is today modern Israel. You can see there on that map as well. There's a lot of different maps of what it looks like, but you can see what the promised land was to be, how encompassing it was. The land God gave to Israel included everything from the Nile River in Egypt up to Lebanon, so from south to north, and everything from the Mediterranean Sea to the Euphrates River going west to east. So on today's map, the land God had stated belongs to Israel includes everything modern-day Israel possesses, plus what is called today the West Bank and Gaza, plus some of Egypt and Syria, plus Jordan, plus some of Saudi Arabia and Iraq. So Israel currently possesses only a fraction of the land that God promises here in Genesis chapter 12. The rest of their inheritance will likely come at the return of Jesus Christ, the Messiah. But God promised a land to Abraham and his descendants. Second, we see the promise to be made a great nation. God also promised Abram, I will make you a great nation. That meant that Abram was going to have children and grandchildren and further descendants enough to populate a great nation. And God made this promise before Abram and Sarah had any kids. She was barren. But God promised, I'll make you a great nation. There will be innumerable descendants that come forth from you. In Jeremiah chapter 31, God gave his word that the nation of Israel will never cease as long as the sun still shines by day and the moon and stars shine by night. And along with being made a great nation was being given a great name. I will bless you and make your name great. Now, this contrasts with what we read in chapter 11 about Nimrod. Nimrod and the people came together at the Tower of Babel, and they said, what did they say? Let us make a name for ourselves. Let's come together. Let's make a name for ourselves apart from God. God says here, no, I will make your name great. I will do it. And God did do that. 3 world religions, as you might call them as world religions, they trace their heritage back to Abraham. He's honored by the Jews, Muslims, and Christians. And one of God's names for himself is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I mean, God identifies himself with the name of Abraham. That's how great God is and the great name that he did with Abraham. Third, the promise of blessing to himself and others. He says, I will bless you, speaking to Abram and to his descendants, and you shall be a blessing. The promise of blessing was not only to Abraham, but it was through Abraham or Abram. First, blessing to blessers and a cursing to cursers. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse him who curses you. I believe this promise is inherited by the covenant descendants of Abraham, the Jewish people, that it remains true today. And it's a root reason for the decline and the death of many empires. Historically speaking, nations that have treated the Jewish people well have often been blessed. Conversely, the opposite happens. And then I read and watch the news as you do, and you hear the rhetoric of those who are enemies of Israel all around her, wanting to throw her into the sea, calling for the elimination of the Jewish state, and praising Hamas and other entities who call for Israel's destruction, trying to destroy any Jewish testimony of any kind historically or geographically. And then on the other side, you have pundits, people and political pundits, and who say, well, Israel needs the United States as an ally, and they really need international support. Here's the biblical truth. The United States and every other nation needs Israel. Just look at all the nations who at one time turned against Israel in ancient history, whether it's the Babylonians, Assyrians, Rome, Egypt. They all became second-rate nations after they turned on Israel and the people of Israel. In modern times, Spain and England. England at one time was the British Empire. The sun never set on the British Empire until they turned against Israel. It was the ruler of the seas and ruler of the world. Read what happened before and during World War II. If you've seen the movie or maybe you've read the book, Exodus, it recounts the story of Jewish people being placed on ships, trying to escape the persecution in Europe, but the British turned them away only for them to die in the boats or to go back to Europe to be confined to concentration camps by the Nazis. Just follow the nations, ancient or modern, that have turned against Israel and see what has become of them. It says, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And that doesn't mean you have to agree with everything that Israel does as a nation or who their president or leader is, but with all the problems we have in our nation, inflation, the economy, border security, healthcare, all those things, this issue supersedes them all. We will decline very fast if we decide not to align ourselves with the nation that God has said, I will bless. I will bless those who bless you. Those are promises you can take to the bank. That promise doesn't go away. Well, second, we have a blessing to the world. It says, in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. God's blessing to Abraham was not for his own sake or just the sake of the Jewish people, the Jewish nation to come. The blessing that God would bring through Abraham was for all the families of the earth. And this amazing promise was fulfilled in the Messiah that came through Abraham's lineage. It was for the whole world, and it was through Jesus Christ. We read in Galatians 3, verse 8, that the Scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel to Abraham beforehand, saying, in you all the nations shall be blessed. So then those who are of faith are blessed with believing Abraham. And then you get to the book of Revelation. In Revelation 5, verse 9, they sang a new song. This is a picture of the worship happening in heaven. And they're saying, you are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slain and have redeemed us to God by your blood out of every tribe and tongue and people and nation. This clearly indicates that the work of Jesus will touch every people group on earth. And through him, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. It will be through the Messiah that will be brought forth from Israel, Abraham's descendants. God has chosen the Jewish people for a very special role in his unfolding plan of the ages. But that role was not the blessing to end with just the Jewish people, the people of Israel. There was a missionary vision that God intended. Abraham's covenant descendants were to look beyond themselves and to all the nations, to all the families of the earth. So we have these amazing promises that God made with Abram. What was Abram's response? Well, now we see Abram's display of faith, beginning in verse 4. So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. So God had spoken this covenant to Abram when he was back in Ur of the Chaldeans. He said, leave your country, leave your family, go to the land that I will show you. But God hadn't told him where he was going to go yet. He just said, go to a land that I will show you. Abram didn't know the exact destination. He just had a promise that God will show him. And that word will, God will show him. That's future tense. Just move, just head out, and I'll tell you when to stop. Unfortunately, his dad told him when to stop. And he told him to stay in Haran. And they stayed there for 15 years until Terah, his father, died. Abram's dad proved to be a delay to finding the will of God. And by the way, the name Terah, the name of his father, literally means delay. Delay. That's exactly what happened. Abram was delayed 15 years because he brought his father, or he came with his father because his father was leading them out of Ur. Abram was still clinging to his family and his past. And for you and I, your past, whatever circumstances that have brought you to this place where you are, your past and who you are as defined by your heritage, your ethnicity, your family, your upbringing, whatever happened in your family for good or for bad, that can either be a hitching post or a guidepost. You can let it hold you back, or you can learn from it and be shaped by it and see it redeemed. But it's either a hitching post that holds you back, or it's a guidepost to take you forward. And it seems that whenever we bring stuff, from our old life and we bring it into our new life in Christ, it can become a problem. It can become a delay in many cases. Well, for Abram, once Abram's father died, God spoke to him again. Okay, let's try this again. Let's do this again. Let's fulfill what I began in you. So he now departed from Haran, but notice Lot went with him. This is another example of partial obedience by Abram. He should have said goodbye to Lot right here and said, I've got to do what God called me to do. I'm supposed to leave my family. I'm supposed to go. Because Lot will not be a blessing in Abram's life. He will only prove to be a distraction and trouble and inconvenience for him. And verse 4 tells us Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Sarai, his wife, was about 10 years younger than Abram. So she's 65, well past the age of that people normally have children. Verse 5, then Abram took Sarai his wife and Lot his brother's son and all their possessions that they had gathered. So they're gathering possessions along the way. And the people whom they had acquired in Haran. So there's an entourage of people here as well. And they departed to go to the land of Canaan. So they came to the land of Canaan. Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, as far as the terebinth tree of Moreh, and the Canaanites were then in the land. So you see, they all go on down to they're in Canaan now. Shechem was Abram's first stopping point in Canaan. He came to this notable oak tree, the terebinth tree of Moreh, which is a type of oak tree, and Shechem was right in the middle of Canaan. And it's interesting to see how important and strategic Shechem is in the unfolding plan of God, of what God does in and through Israel. Jacob will later buy a piece of land there and dig a well. And by New Testament times, it will be called Sychar, the land of Samaria. Jesus will go there. He's going to talk to a woman who's at this same well that Jacob dug. In fact, she's going to say, are you greater than our father Jacob who gave us this well? It's an extremely important piece of land. So Abram finally came to the land of Canaan. And the first place he stops is Shechem. But it says the Canaanites were still in the land. And they have no intention of giving it away. In fact, they won't give it away. They won't give it up until they are forced out by God's judgment 400 years later. Understand, Abram came into Canaan as an outsider to live in a land that was populated by a people group who were extremely violent and wicked. In verse 7, then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. And there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. Once Abram was in the land, God reminded him of his promise. In fact, it says that the Lord appeared to Abram. I don't know if this was a physical appearance or some sort of spiritual presence, but God repeats the first promise of the covenant. He makes it clear that this land that Abram saw, it belonged to him and his descendants. It didn't have the title deed just yet, but it would be theirs. And understand, this was real land. Abram could walk on it, walk on the soil. It was physical land, not a spiritual land that God promised Abraham or Abram and his covenant descendants. This was real land. In fact, it tells us here, notice the promise was, to your descendants I will give this land. Abram himself never owned any of this land except for the burial plot that he bought for he and his wife Sarai, where they would be buried. Yet God said, it's not in your possession yet, but it's promised to you and to all of your descendants. And what is Abram's response? Worship. He built an altar to the Lord. This altar was the first altar of worship to God built on pagan soil. This was an act of faith that God would do what he said he would do in giving the land to his descendants. And for Abram, this altar was a place for him to meet with God, to worship God, and to express his faith in God. So Abram came to Shechem, and he built an altar to the Lord. In verse 8, he moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. He built another altar to the Lord between Bethel and Ai, and here he called on the name of the Lord. This is a great display of faith on Abram's part. He believes that God will fulfill his promise. So he's worshiping the Lord. Verse 9, so Abram journeyed going on still toward the south, entering deeper into the land of Canaan. So Abram finally comes into the land of Canaan. He worships the Lord. He calls on the name of the Lord. These are acts of faith and steps of obedience. But in verse 10, we're going to see Abram have a lapse of faith, which leads to disobedience. That's how those work together. Our faith demonstrates itself in obedience. A lack of faith displays itself in disobedience. His trust in the Lord wavers, and now he takes matters into his own hands, and it doesn't turn out very well. So now we come to Abram's lapse of faith in verse 10. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to dwell there, for the famine was severe in the land. We don't know how long Abram was there before the famine came. Famines typically take a little bit of time to develop. Now, a famine, it's a serious problem today. And it's tragic when people die of hunger. In our modern world, it's tragic when that happens. You see it happen at different places around the world. Well, in the ancient world, it was even a bigger problem. It happened much more frequently. Abram was right to be concerned about this famine. He was right to be concerned about feeding his household. But Abram was wrong to think that God would not provide for his needs in the place where God called him to live. God called Abram to Canaan, not to Egypt. And implicit in God's calling Abram to Canaan was that God would provide for him and his family in Canaan. You could say that God's promise to bring Abram to Canaan and to give him the land was also an implicit promise to provide for him there. So understand, wherever God has called you, he will provide for you. Wherever God has called you, he will provide for you. But Abram says, no, I have to leave this place that God promised me and go down to Egypt. And like so many of us today, you could say that he found it easier to trust God in the far-off promises rather than in the right-now needs. where Abram said, I know you promised me and my descendants this land. I know it's going to be ours one day, but we know we got to eat. So I need to take care of this and do this myself. But the same God who is faithful in the far-off promises, he is faithful in our right now needs, and we can trust him for that. But Abram, nevertheless, he went down to Egypt. And Egypt was a lot like his homeland of Ur of the Chaldeans. It had rivers feeding into valleys. It was fertile soil. So he's going to a place that he knows can sustain life during a famine. Using common sense, it made sense to go there. It's a place that was a lot like home for him. In verse 11, it came to pass when he was close to entering Egypt that he said to Sarai, his wife, Indeed, I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance. Therefore, it will happen when the Egyptians see you that they will say, This is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say you are my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, and that I may live because of you. So she's in her mid-60s at this time. Yet Abram was concerned about her attractiveness to the Egyptians. Now, Abram will live to be 175 years old. Sarah will live to be 127. So if she's in her mid-60s, relatively speaking, she's middle-aged. You could say that. Like she's in her mid-30s or something. But it's fair to say she was a woman of particular beauty. She was striking. That not just externally, but there was something inside of her that was glowing out of her. She was a woman of particular beauty, but Abram perceived this as a problem. And how does he hope to solve the problem? Say that you're my sister. Abram realized that if a prominent man, a king or a ruler, saw his wife, Sarai, and that she's the wife of some companion who's of prominence and had wealth, a man like Abram, well, that ruler could just take her, kill the husband, and take all his possessions. And that's how things worked at that time. Abram is thinking about his personal safety. And so he comes up with a plan. Sarah, I say that you're my sister. And it is half true. This was a half truth because Sarai was Abram's half sister, according to Genesis chapter 20, verse 12. But a half truth is a whole lie. Abram's intent here was to deceive, and he was trusting in his ability to deceive to protect himself instead of trusting in the Lord. And when we want to do something wrong, it's always possible to find a good reason for it. We can come up with some great excuses and great reasons to justify it. So Abram is hiding behind his wife and telling Sarai, hey, I'm going to put you in danger to protect me. That's what he's doing here. This is terrible what he's doing. He wasn't trusting God. He certainly wasn't putting his wife first. He was putting his own safety first. Now, if he was as full of faith in the early years as he would become in later years, he might have said something like, God promised me children. He said a nation would come forth from me, and since I don't have a single child yet, I know that nothing will happen to me until God's promises are fulfilled. Because his promises are always true. God will protect me. He will protect my wife Sarai because he made a promise that we would have children. He could have said that. But Abram, he's learning to walk in faith. He was growing in faith. This was far from full obedience. This isn't even partial obedience here. He never should have left Canaan. This is all Abram here. Verse 14, so it was when Abram came into Egypt that the Egyptians saw the woman, that she was very beautiful. The princes of Pharaoh also saw her and commended her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. So Sarai attracted attention because she was a very beautiful woman and because she was the companion of a wealthy and influential man. They didn't know that Abram was her husband. I mean, there was a whole entourage of people they're bringing with them. They just knew that she was the companion of this obviously wealthy and influential man. Therefore, she was taken into Pharaoh's house. Now, this was an especially serious problem in terms of the place that Abram and Sarai had in God's redemptive plan. Remember, back in verses 1 through 3, it said that it would be through Abram that the Messiah would come. It was through him that the whole world would be blessed. And God didn't want Sarai's womb to be taken or defiled by a Gentile king, a pagan king, because the Messiah was to come through her line of descendants. And notice verse 16, this is Pharaoh, treated Abram well for her sake. He had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels. Now, so it says servants in there, verse 16. One of those is a woman named Hagar. She comes into the story later as well. So he's getting all of these possessions. Abraham received wealth beyond what he already had. All these gifts were meant to raise Pharaoh in the esteem of this family because it looked as if Sarai would be married into Pharaoh's family. God's blessing and protection was on Abram, even when Abram was lying and deceiving. God didn't call back his promise to Abraham, even still at this point, because the promise depended upon God, not Abram. And so God is now going to intervene, verse 17 and 18. But the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. And Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife?" So he rebukes this man of faith. You know, whenever we sin, we never sin alone. It always has ramifications far beyond just who you are and what you're doing. It affects the people around you. Abram puts his wife in jeopardy, and because he lied to Pharaoh, he's putting Pharaoh and his household in jeopardy, all because of the disobedience of Abram and his lapse of faith. If your doubt leads you to disobedience, you become dangerous. And Abram was dangerous. God said that Abram was to be a blessing, but no, he turned out to be a curse to Pharaoh and his household. There's no mention of Abram when he's in Egypt. There's no mention of him praying or building an altar or worshiping God or even calling on the name of God while he's in Egypt. Nothing about this trip to Egypt was of God. This was all of Abram. Verse 19, "Why did you say, 'She is my sister'? I might have taken her as my wife." Now, that indicates that he did not. "Now, therefore, here is your wife. Take her and go your way." So Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. A pagan king had to rebuke Abram. Here's the unbelieving Pharaoh rebuking the man of faith, the father of those who believe. He says, "What are you doing? I could have had your wife. Now take her." He sends an entourage of people. Get out of here. But in that, God protects and blesses Abram despite his lack of faith. In fact, God's divine protection of Abram and Sarai shows that if Abram would have trusted in God and stayed in Canaan, God would have provided for him and his family. And here, if God would have trusted God and told the truth, God would have protected them. But God was in the business of developing Abram into a man of great faith. And this requires circumstances where Abram had to trust God. That's just how it works. We all want to grow in our faith. We say, "Oh, yeah, I want to grow in my faith." We all want to grow in our relationship with the Lord. And so there will be times when that will require us to be placed in situations where the only thing we have to trust in is the Lord himself. And God will continually show himself faithful in those times and in those seasons. Abram is called the father of faith, the father of those that believe. He obviously didn't start out that way. There were steps of faith. There was partial faith. And there was doubt. There was disobedience. His faith was imperfect, just like yours and mine. Our faith is imperfect. And so you and I are going to face tests of our faith. Some people panic whenever they get a test or a trial, like, "Oh no, what happened? God doesn't love me anymore. I'm facing a test." Listen, how would you ever know if your faith is real unless it's tested? It's easy to trust God when there's money in the bank and all your bills are paid and things are going well. But when the economy dwindles and things get tight, is God still going to provide for me? How is your faith then? Faith is like a muscle. And if you want to build up a muscle, you break it down. You apply pressure against it, and then you push against that pressure, and that process builds muscle. It's the same for faith. The pressure is what builds you up. And you will never know if you had faith at all unless it was tested. And understand, tests of your faith are prescribed by God to strengthen and develop your faith. So Abram's life illustrates so many truths of the Christian life, but we're to navigate life's problems by standing on God's promises. And Jesus is the fulfillment of all of God's promises. Our faith journey begins when we put our faith and trust in Jesus Christ, the Lord Jesus, the Messiah, the deliverer, the seed of promise that was promised back in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. So how do we approach him? To put our faith in him initially? Well, it begins by coming to him like a child. Matthew 18, verse 2, Jesus, he called the little children to him and placed a child among them, and he said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." We come like a child, humbly, with this childlike faith and humility, but it doesn't end there. We grow in our faith. Matthew 17:20 says, "Assuredly I say to you, if you have faith as a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you." Like a mustard seed, faith starts small, like a mustard seed, but it grows and it develops as we walk in obedience and stand on God's promises. Let's pray.